Fontaine is the worst place in Teyvat to be a kid. I know others have noticed it as well. The amount of kids in Fontaine who are orphaned, trafficked, illegitimate, or rejected is unusually high. And I don't think it's a coincidence either. This is the Unlikely Genshin Gamer, and we're going to analyze the criminal situation in Fontaine that has created so many disadvantaged children. Spoilers ahead for Wriothesely, Freminet, and Lyney's story quests, as well as many of the world quests in Fontaine, the Archon quest, and the recent event story Roses and Muskets. In addition to this, you should exercise caution if the subject matter of dark childhood suffering is triggering for you. Now, let's talk about Fontaines Children. Before I start ranting about orphans in Fontaine, let me justify my observations by pointing out exactly how many characters, both playable and NPC, exist whose identity is at least partially defined by the fact that their childhood was riddled with suffering. Just look at the roster of playable characters who come from dark childhood backgrounds. Wriothesely, Lyney, Lynette, and Freminet. And then there is the prevalence of this among the NPCs in Fontaine, which we learn through studying the Vision Bearers. It paints a picture of a nation with a deep-rooted problem. Wriothesely was left on a doorstep of an orphanage as a baby, only to then become the victim of a robust and large network of child traffickers who not only catered to the rich and powerful, but also violently revised their stock whenever they proved any less profitable. He ran away from this situation and lived on the streets rather than go back to an orphanage until he could take the law in his own hands and kill them. Because he was confident the law would not prevail in bringing them to justice. Although one could argue he was an angry, impatient young man at the time of the murder, this still says something about the legal atmosphere. After all, they still hadn't been caught by the time he did the deed. How many kids fell through the cracks of society from that despicable couple alone? Lyney and Lynette were orphans as well, scraping by on the street, using magic tricks to score food and sometimes shelter. Until Lynette's unique features caught the eye of a degenerate noble who tried to take her for his own disgusting purposes. At that point, Arlecchino saved her from the situation and recruited both twins into the House of the Hearth, which itself is, of course, an orphanage that, under the direction of the fourth harbinger, the Knave, has become the spy network of the Fatui. Many of the Fatui footmen we have to fight in the overworld originate from this establishment. At its core, it is completely staffed by orphaned children. Only the implants and agents in strategic positions of society are adults. Then there is Freminet, the twins' best friend, who grew up in the slums of Fleur-Sonder with a mother struggling to pay off a husband's gambling debts that had tragically landed him in the grave. Only for the same loan sharks who had dealt with her husband to lay down an impossible choice before her. Come up with the remaining money now, an impossible feat, or hand over her son. Before she lost her life to those same evil men that the justice system could not save her from, she tried to safeguard her son by sending him to the House of the Hearth, which at the time was under the jurisdiction of the previous director, a far less merciful leader. Freminet saw many things during his stay there before Arlecchino took over and before meeting the twins, including, as he mentioned in the Thelxie event story, many children there who were afflicted by the mysterious loneliness disease that, as the name implied, caused extreme loneliness, despair, delusions, and in extreme cases, death. All of this happening in the nation which, on the surface at least, values justice above all else. Is this justice? Look at the theater troupe in Freminet story quest. Dulphie was abandoned to the unforgiving streets as a child because she had an incurable illness. Loic also grew up in an orphanage, the displaced son of a murderer. The entire cast of the Narcissan Crew's quest line grew up as displaced children, and yet went on to make a mark on Fontaine's history. Basil Elton, the Admiral of Fontaine's Navy. Carl Ingold, a prestigious reporter for the Steambird. Dwight Lasker, director of the Institute of Natural Philosophy, the precursor to the Fontaine Research Institute. Emmanuel Guillotin, a chief officer in the Marechaussee Phantom. And of course, all 4 children of the story, Renee, Jacob, Alain, and Marianne. 3 of the 4 being exceptionally intelligent. Yet every single one of these people grew up in the orphanage known as the Narcissan Crew's Institute in the Court of Fontaine. Even this recent event, Roses and Muskets, perfectly illustrated the type of situation wrapped in intrigue, deceit, and tragedy that would feed into this blooming population of orphans. And it isn't rare either. Finding and blackmailing these entitled individuals in the upper echelons of Fontainian society is the bread and butter of the House of the Hearth. It's a well-known problem in the country. So what is going on? Why is it that the nation of justice is the nation with the largest thriving criminal element, while also possessing the most well-stocked prison of any nation as well? I've analyzed the other nations too, and this just isn't the case anywhere else. To be honest, one would have expected such a situation in Mondstadt, if anywhere. A nation with no ruler, no obvious court system, where wine and merriment reign supreme. But between the influence of the church, which no other nation seems to have, and the Knights of Favonius, especially Kaya's and Diluc's own unchecked liberal brand of justice, life in Mondstadt is some of the happiest and safest to be found. And there's proof. Remember how Neuvillette and Lynette explained that water carries emotions in it? This means that the state of a nation's water reflects its social atmosphere. Neuvillette isn't just talking about water in his idle animation, where he articulates the varying tastes of the nation's waters. He's telling us about the state of affairs in each nation, and Mondstadt is definitely the happiest of the countries. Even the Oceanids agree. 2 separate Oceanids, Caliroe and the little Oceanid Endura, took up residence in Springvale Lake because of how pure and sweet its water is. It's why Mondstadt's wine from the waters of sweet, pure Cider Lake are unmatched. Yet here in Fontaine, water filled with so much sorrow and fear that it can be used as a torture device exists to be bought and sold. That alone tells us so much that there is no denying it at all. And think about this. A rainy season exists in Fontaine that mysteriously coincides with the busiest time in the opera epiclese. Neuvillette, moved by the despair that comes before him day after day, trial after trial, that he cannot truly judge fairly because of the constraints of the laws of Fontaine, lets that emotion flow outward in the form of a sad rain. The system in the nation of justice is severely flawed. This is why so many children are bereft of their parents, and why so many of them are robbed of a fair approach to life. But then I find myself wondering, could the disproportionate levels of degeneracy and criminal inclination have anything to do with the fact that they were not true humans? They were Oceanids turned human who had to learn the ways and mannerisms of humanity through the generations. Did something go wrong in that process? I don't know. Mondstadt's biggest problems are treasure hoarders and the abyss of all things, and they have the Dark Knight hero to deal with it, who is not encumbered by the law. Liyue's main affliction is Archon residue from Zhongli's exceedingly bloody campaign in the Archon War, but Xiao performs his duties of cleansing it valiantly. The Qixing handle everything else diligently. The other nations as well, possessing far less rigid justice systems that are more open to personal interpretation, seem to fare far better than Fontaine. Now, don't get me wrong, the darker, more gritty storytelling is intriguing and far more riveting. It's why I like the desert so much with its dark Aramite storylines of Gurubad and Lilopar and Mother Babel. But Fontaine definitely stands out. I am very interested to get you guys' take on this aspect of Fontainian society. What's the reason? And could we see more of this or worse in Natlan and Snezhnaya? Or is it localized here to Fontaine because it's the nation of justice? Let me know what you think. As always, thanks for watching, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. You guys are the best. Stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.